Hey, all you Galatians studying peeps. Lesson number 2, Galatians 2, 6 through 18. The name of this lesson is The Power of Influence. Yeah, this is me when I go to church on Sundays. Influence. So the churches in Galatia were under attack that Jesus was not enough to be saved. He wrote the letter to counter those claims. So chapter 2 is all about influence, but we're going to look at this here. Chapter 2 will go in depth. But here, Jesus, and Paul is going to be all about telling them that Jesus should be the one who is primarily influencing their lives. Who influences your life the most? Who has influenced your life the most? So Paul is countering the influence of the legalistic Jews and countering the fact that they were trying to bring greater influence by citing the influence of Jerusalem. We are all from Jerusalem, the mothership, kind of. Where is Paul from? Validating that Jerusalem was the real message. And in verses 6 through 7, we see that Paul is saying, I went to Jerusalem. I shared the gospel. They added nothing. We were all in agreement. So he went to the disciples like we talked about last week and said, hey, this is what I've been preaching. And it's from God. And they said, that's exactly what we are preaching. And we were with God. We were with Jesus. And so they were in agreement with their what they were preaching. And, Paul's telling them, don't listen to the lies. Verse 7, on the contrary, I went and met with the guys. He offered the right hand of and they offered the right hand of fellowship, which meant that they were in agreement. So Paul is pulling out the rug from underneath the legalistic influence by dropping names. And in verse 9, Peter is another name, which is another name for the one that he lists. And I can't pronounce it real good. I think it's Cephas. Cephas. Anyway, and so, Peter even talks about that in his writings. So let's look at verses 11 through 16. Peter was fallible. Even though he was a big deal, some think of him as the first pope. But Paul rebuked Peter. And we're not Catholics in our belief, but the first the first church in the Bible was, I'm trying to think, was it James? He was the first head of the church in the new church in Acts. I might be wrong on that one. I was trying to think of it. All of us, when you get old, your memory, you're like, James, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, verse 11, I opposed him to his face. And verse 12, James was the brother of Jesus and the pastor. It's right here in my notes. And the pastor of the church at Jerusalem, the first of the initial church. But influence, in verse 13, Barnabas was led astray by hypocrisy. And if you'll read some of the writings of Paul, him and Barnabas didn't always get along because he was led astray by hypocrisy. And one of the things that Paul was rebuking Peter over was whether to eat or not to eat. And Paul is telling the people in Galatia that at some point he made his way up to Antioch, which is north of Jerusalem in Syria. And as Antioch was the hub of Christianity activity, not Jerusalem at the time. And Paul and Barnabas lived in Antioch and they were teaching in the church, which was growing at a huge pace. Peter comes up from Jerusalem to check it out. While there, Peter felt like it was okay to eat with the Gentiles. But no, defiled if you did so. You ate with a common loaf because the Gentiles, and at the time it was a common practice that you ate with a common loaf and you dipped in the same bowl. You double dipped. And if you did so, you were defiling yourself. And I got to tell you, there is something nasty about double dipping. But Peter felt like it was okay to eat with the Gentiles. But once the legalistic Jews got there, Peter stopped eating with the Gentiles. This is why Paul rebuked him. Would only eat with, and at the time Peter would only eat with other Jews. And the other Jews got into this hypocrisy like Barnabas did as well. So Paul recognizes the power of influence, and he knows the legalistic Jews' power. So he calls out Peter publicly. Was that necessary? It's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. This is the same Peter that received a vision from the Lord that it was okay to eat unclean foods and told the Jews that God had accepted the Gentiles. Peter knew better. Distinctions do not matter to God. Write that down. Does a man or a woman matter? Peter was insinuating that Jesus was not enough and needed to withdraw from the worth before God to be worth before God. Paul knew Peter was in danger of throwing the whole gospel under the bus. So I want to ask you, can we get worn down by the power of influence? What influences you today? A man in the pulpit, a certain man? Is it God's word only? Peter just got worn down. Have we built up or worn down? Are we worn down by daily influences? Leaders compromise what they know to be true. If they do so, they are living hypocritically. Paul felt the need to publicly admonish Peter. And so Paul wanted the Galatians to know that they were having the same power of influence levied upon them. So, when you think about it, negative influence, such as books, movies, and I'm not saying you don't need to go to them. That's not what I'm saying. Or you don't need to go to movies. That's not what I'm saying at all. But there might be someone at work yapping in your ear, some kind of negative. We have to seek godly influence. Okay? When I was growing up, it was considered it's been a day or two. Going to movies is a sin. Going to dances is a sin. And I'm not saying it's not a sin, but I'm saying we could really get into a deep conversation here. But go to verse 16 and underline the last phrase, and then goes right into verse 17. We mess up, we're found to be sinners. Common criticism Paul received from the legalist. You can't tell people that they do not have rules. You can't go to the movies, rule number 1. Don't go to movies, dances. Paul taught that saved by grace and we are kept by grace. The holiness is refined in our lives by grace, not by works, which made legalists at the time crazy. And it still does. You're saying you can go out and sin all you want as Jesus promotes sin? No. Verse 18, look at verse 18. If I go back and wallow in that sin that I previously left behind, that is on me, not Jesus. But if we sin, we have an advocate. Okay? So verses 19 through 21. Most profound verses. There are some profound verses in the Bible, and these are one of them. If we are saved by being a good person, then why did Jesus die? It nullifies, I did not ignore the grace of God. We identify with Jesus in baptism and fellowship, etc., reading his word. That is how we identify with Jesus. So I want you to think about this when you read these verses and meditate on them this week. Have a good week. See you next week. It's going to get good. Galatians is all about the security of the believer.